The Vyazma Airborne operation was a Red Army airborne landing in the rear of German lines during the battles of Rzhev. It took place from January 18 to February 28, 1942. The objective of the airborne landing was to help troops of the Kalinin Front and Western Front to encircle and destroy Army Group Center. The operation began on January 8, 1942 with the aim of encircling Army Group Center. In the first stages of the operation, the Red Army achieved some successes. The Soviet command had reason for optimism. Just the day before, two relatively successful tactical landings were carried out, on January 4 in the area southeast of Medin, and on the night of January 18 in the area of the village of Znamenka and the village of Zelenai, 40 kilometers south of Vyazma. As a result of the attacks of the Kalinin and Western fronts, the German lines were breached in several places. In order to facilitate the advance of the troops, the Soviet High Command decided to land troops south of Vyazma with the objective of cutting the Vyazma-Yukhnov Highway and the Vyazma-Bryansk Railroad. However, landing an entire corps required not only determination and audacity, but also logistical support with appropriate preparation. The planned drop zone was guarded by scattered German units. The first group of airborne troops, composed of the 201st Airborne Brigade and the 250th Airborne Regiment, was landed in the rear of German troops south of Vyazma from 18 to January 22. The Soviet Airborne Force was a separate branch of the Soviet Armed Forces. First formed before the Second World War, the force undertook two significant airborne operations and a number of smaller jumps during the war, and for many years after 1945 was the largest airborne force in the world. The Soviet airborne forces were noted for their relatively large number of vehicles, specifically designed for airborne transport. As such, they traditionally had a larger complement of heavy weaponry than most contemporary airborne forces. The Soviet airborne forces were mostly used as foot infantry during the war. Only a few small airborne drops were carried out in the first desperate days of Operation Barbarossa, in the vicinity of Kiev, Odessa, and the Kerch Peninsula. The first significant airborne operations of the war was the Vyazma operation, involving 4th Airborne Corps. This corps was formed in the spring of 1941 in the Western Special Military District from the personnel of the 214th Airborne Brigade. On June 22, 1941, the corps was stationed in the Western Front's second echelon in the Minsk region. During the Rzhev-Vyazma operation in early 1942, the corps was dropped behind German lines in the Yukhnov direction 25 kilometers south of Vyazma in the Vyazma Airborne operation. 7,373 parachutists and 1,524 bales with ammunition and equipment were dropped. To prevent a German retreat from the planned encirclement, Stavka decided to land troops in the Vyazma area to cut the Vyazma-Smolensk railroads and highways. On January 27, the dropping of 4th Airborne Corps in the village of Ozareknia. Due to a shortage of transport planes, the paratroop drops were made in an alternating order, starting with 8th Airborne Brigade. German aircraft attacked the transport planes in the air and on the ground. As a result of German bombing raids on airfields, 7 Tupolev transport aircraft were destroyed. Soviet commanders tried to take the most serious measures to cover the airfields. Unfortunately, it was not possible to deliver small-caliber anti-aircraft guns at the time of the start of German raids on airfields. They arrived in the following days, but the air defense was reinforced by a solid detachment of fighters, more than 60 aircraft at the expense of units of the Polar Fleet Air Force and the 6th Air Defense Army Moscow. However, there was also very little fighter cover for the transport aircraft and many were shot down. Some Soviet fighter regiments were only recently formed and arrived at the front in late December, early January. It was too reckless to expect anything outstanding from them. It should be noted that all the airfields intended for landing troops were known to the Germans. Moreover, they conducted reconnaissance throughout January, and periodically also carried out bombing attacks. Having about 50 serviceable Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters in the area of operations, the Germans easily reached the airfields of the Kaluga air hub from the airfields in Bryansk and Vyazma, and on the evening of January 27, the first raid on the Grabtsevo airfield took place. The German squadrons had many well-trained ace pilots who went through all the campaigns and had more than 15 victories in the air. As a result of this, as well as worsening weather conditions, Stavka was forced to suspend drops. However, 3 battalions of the 8th Airborne Brigade, comprising 2,100 airborne troops, had been landed by February 1, along with 34.4 tons of supplies. The landing itself was unsuccessful, as a large part of the supplies were lost, and the airborne troops were scattered over a wide area in winter weather conditions. The spread between the landing sites was sometimes up to 100 kilometers. The paratroopers had no heavy weapons, only 27 light mortars and 72 anti-tank rifles were landed. It was not always possible to assemble units, and some of the paratroopers were destroyed immediately after landing. It is not surprising that it was not possible to capture sites acceptable for the landing force, and the main part of the 4th Airborne Division was simply not landed. The Germans did not stop there, and with improved weather conditions in the first days of February, they resumed raids with typical Luftwaffe persistence. They reconnoitered the airfields, took aim and prepared. The ghost of the summer of 1941 with all the ensuing unpleasant consequences loomed before the remaining Soviet Air Force units. Undoubtedly, the demonstrated qualitative superiority of the Luftwaffe in almost all components, in the organization of reconnaissance, management of combat operations, better training of crews and technical superiority of aircraft and weapons. All this had a direct impact on the Soviet offensive operation. As a result, only 1,320 paratroopers were able to reform into coherent units. The airborne troops attempted to cut German communications west of Vyazma. In a few days, they knocked out some parts of the railroad and highway and captured the headquarters of some German units. On January 31, 1942, German Chief of the Army General Staff Franz Halder wrote that the position of the troops of the 4th Army is very serious. There have been difficulties with supply. By February 6, the survivors of the 8th Airborne Brigade had linked up with 1st Guards Cavalry Corps. Its units were included in the corps structure after the link-up. By mid-February in the area of Vyazma, an extremely difficult situation had developed. The Soviet forces failed to encircle the German troops and the fighting dragged on. The Soviet High Command decided to drop the main forces of the 4th Airborne Corps west of Yukhnov with the task of cutting the Warsaw Highway and linking up with parts of the 50th Army. The landing of the 9th and 214th Airborne Brigades took place at night from 16 to February 24. During this period, 1,525 paratroopers and 7,373 supply bales were dropped in the area of Zelanja. The landing took place with the active opposition of the Germans. On February 23, the 4th Airborne Corps commander Major General Alexei Levashev was killed when his transport was shot down. On the ground, the airborne troops faced strong German resistance. However, the airborne troops were able to link up with the 50th Army on February 28, but the ground troops were unable to break through the German lines, and the offensive stalled. Left in the German rear, the Soviet paratroopers of the 4th Airborne Corps, in conjunction with the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps and elements of 33rd Army, conducted active military operations. Elements of the airborne troops were destroyed during Operation Hanover. The United Forces seized the area south of Vyazma and held it until the end of May, pinning down a few German divisions. On the night of May 26, the group finally broke through the encirclement and joined the 10th Army on June 24. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss my future work, please make sure you are subscribed to my channel and press the bell notification button. Thank you and see you in the next video.